After 30 years away, the old veteran thought the ranch held nothing for him anymore, until his horse uncovered the one secret buried deep enough to destroy everything he believed. He came home expecting silence, dust, and the kind of loneliness only old men understand. But on his first morning back, his horse froze at the tree line, ears locked, breath sharp, staring into a place even the wind refused to cross. And in that moment, the veteran knew. Something out there had been waiting for him. The first wind of late October swept across the Wyoming basin like a long, tired sigh, one that carried dust, brittle sage, and the faint smell of something that had been forgotten for far too long. Eamon Harlow eased his old truck off the gravel road, the tires crunching over stones that no one had disturbed in decades. The land looked larger than he remembered. Lonelier, too, as if it had been holding its breath since the day he left. 30 years is enough time to lose a war, rebuild a life, and forget the sound of your own footsteps on familiar ground. Yet as the ranch appeared at the bottom of the slope, Eamon felt something move inside his chest, something he thought he buried alongside his father. The ranch had collapsed into a skeleton of its former self. The barn leaned like an old man refusing to fall, and the house, once painted a cheerful wheat gold by his mother, was nothing more than charred ribs of timber. Time had not been kind here. Winter storms had carved deep scars through the pasture, and the fencing sagged under its own memories. He stepped out of the truck, letting the cold wind cut across his face. It was a tough, honest cold. Nothing like the stale air of motels he'd drifted through after leaving the service. Out here, everything was real. Even the silence. Dakota, his 12-year-old bay gelding, pawed at the dirt before lowering his head to sniff the wind. The horse's ears twitched, alert but unafraid, as if recognizing the land even more clearly than Eamon. The two had seen things together in the mounted patrol, quiet nights along the border, sudden storms, and the kind of danger that teaches a man to breathe differently. Dakota nudged Eamon's arm gently, as if asking whether they'd come home for good or just passing through. Eamon didn't have an answer. Coming back felt like opening a letter he'd been afraid to read. He walked toward the remains of the house, boots sinking softly into the cold earth. Under the broken porch beam, he spotted a metal address plate, half buried, half burnt. Harlow Ranch. The letters were still legible, stubborn as the family who once lived here. His father had built this place with hands calloused from ranch work and war, a man who believed in property taxes, honest wages, and the kind of home insurance that kept a family safe through anything but fire. Eamon crouched, picking up the plate. The metal was cold, but it warmed slowly in his palm. He didn't want to admit the truth forming in his mind. The ranch hadn't died of neglect. It had died of abandonment. A gust of wind shook loose a shutter from the ruined house, sending it clattering across the yard. Dakota jerked his head and snorted, but Eamon simply stood there, letting the sound crash through him like a memory. 30 years ago, a fight with his father, sharp words, neither of them meaning any of it, had driven him out into the world. He had promised to come back. Then life took him the long way around. Wars have a habit of rearranging priorities until home becomes a place you send postcards to, not a place you stand on. He walked around what used to be the kitchen window. Sunlight cut through the gaps in the walls, revealing the blackened support beams. The fire must have happened after he left. No one ever told him. Maybe no one knew where to find him. For a moment, Eamon wished he'd purchased one of those modern veterans' life insurance plans people talked about nowadays, something to put order to the chaos he always carried. But the thought passed quickly. Paperwork had never saved anyone. What mattered was being here now. Dakota wandered a few steps away, head turned toward the tree line that bordered the back of the property. His body grew still, not tense, but curious, the way a trained horse senses something before a man does. Eamon followed his gaze. Beyond the fence lay a strip of woods, darker than the surrounding hills, as if the trees there remembered something the rest of the land forgot. He squinted, trying to see what Dakota had noticed, but the shadows offered no explanation. "Easy, boy," Eamon murmured, placing a hand on the horse's warm shoulder. "We just got here." Dakota didn't settle. His ears angled forward, tail flicking once, twice. Eamon frowned. He had learned long ago never to ignore a horse's instinct. They hear the world differently, footsteps you can't hear, breath patterns you can't see. Something was out there, something watching, or waiting. Eamon inhaled slowly, the cold air scraping his lungs. He took in the mountain ridge, the patchwork sky, the half-dead cottonwoods bending under the weight of autumn. He wasn't a young man anymore. His knees ached in the cold, the way old injuries whisper warnings. Yet standing here, he felt an old version of himself waking up. The soldier, the cowboy, the son who left too soon. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the land, to the wind, to whoever might be listening. "Tomorrow, we'll look around." But Dakota wasn't looking toward tomorrow. The gelding kept staring into the trees, muscles tightening just slightly, as if he already sensed the secret that had been waiting 30 years for Eamon to return. And somewhere, beneath that canopy of pine and shadow, something shifted in response. Something that would change everything. Dakota did not move for a long while, his dark eyes fixed on the shadowed strip of forest as if listening to something Eamon couldn't hear. The morning light, thin and pale, stretched across the pasture in slow bands, revealing frost clinging to the weeds like stubborn memories. Eamon tightened Dakota's bridle out of habit, though they weren't going anywhere yet. His gloved hand paused on the horse's neck. The warmth there felt almost too alive for a place that seemed forgotten by everything else. A man could live his whole life and never see a horse so still, so focused, unless something out there was calling to it. Eamon followed the direction of Dakota's ears, but all he saw were trees packed tightly like secrets. 30 years ago, he and his father had fenced off that area to keep cattle from wandering too far uphill. Now the posts lay rotting, half swallowed by the earth. He felt a small ache behind his ribs, the same ache he'd felt walking through VA hallways where men waited to see if they qualified for veterans' disability benefits, to be told whether their pain was official. Some wounds weren't on paper. Some wounds walked beside you on 4 legs. Dakota snorted once, sharp and impatient. He tugged lightly against the reins, not in fear, but insistence. Eamon knew the difference. The horse wanted to go. Something in those woods was pulling him, a gravity older than the ranch itself. "All right," Eamon muttered, checking the cinch. "If you've got a notion, let's see it." They began at a slow walk toward the back boundary of the property. The air shifted the moment they crossed into the older part of the pasture. The wind died. The world went quiet enough for Eamon to hear the creak of saddle leather and Dakota's steady breathing. Last night's worries about the shattered house, the years he'd wasted, The insurance papers he should have handled before everything burned fell away. The only thing that mattered now was whatever waited beyond the broken fence. Dakota stepped over fallen rails with surprising ease for a horse his age. Eamon could feel energy coiling beneath the gelding's ribs, a kind of alertness he hadn't seen since their patrol days. Then he saw them. Impressions in the frost. Tracks. Not Dakota's. Smaller, lighter, sharp-edged. Fresh. Someone, or something, had come through recently. Eamon dismounted, crouching to brush the frost lightly with his fingers. The print was unmistakable. A horse. A young one, judging by the narrow shape. But the spacing was strange. One step deep, the next barely touching. Another dragged. An injured animal, wandering alone. He felt Dakota shift behind him, lowering his head to sniff the ground. The gelding's breath formed a cloud over the tracks, as if he were trying to warm the trail. "Well," Eamon whispered, "that explains the fuss." The tracks led straight into the darker part of the woods, where the pines grew dense and the morning sun filtered through in narrow silver shards. It was territory Eamon hadn't set foot in since he was a boy, a place his father once called the Ridge's blind spot, where snowstorms settled first and coyotes circled last. But there was no ignoring it, not with Dakota pawing the ground like this. Branches brushed against Eamon's jacket as they entered the tree line. The air held the smell of cold earth and something faintly metallic. Not blood, more like rusted wire or an old trap left behind. The forest swallowed sound so completely that Eamon's breath felt too loud. Even Dakota's hoofbeats were muffled, reduced to soft thuds that disappeared under the pine needles. 100 feet in, Eamon saw where the brush had been parted. A path, not made by men, but by something desperate enough to force its way through. He ducked under a low branch, pulling Dakota along carefully. The horse's ears flicked forward at every sound, every shift of shadow. Eamon could feel his partner's pulse through the reins, steady but keyed up, like a violin string tuned one note too tight. Then he heard it. A sound barely audible, like a breath caught in the throat of the forest. A tremor. A soft, uneven exhale. Dakota stopped dead, muscles locking beneath Eamon's hand. "There," Eamon whispered. He moved slowly through the undergrowth, stepping around a fallen log. The smell reached him first. Damp fur mingled with the sharp tang of fear. Then he saw the impression of a hoof pressed deeply into the mud, followed by another dragged step. The tracks angled toward a narrow gulch where two boulders leaned together like tired shoulders. Dakota lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Something was inside that crack in the earth. Eamon approached with the caution of a man who has seen too much to be careless. "Easy now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Dakota or himself. The light thinned as the walls of the gulch rose on either side, and a thin ribbon of frost clung to the shaded stone. Then, beneath that dim light, came movement. A flick of an ear. A shiver of a flank. Not Dakota. Another horse. Young. Thin. Trembling. A chestnut mare wedged between the stones, one front leg twisted awkwardly under her body. Her eyes were wild but glassy, the eyes of an animal too exhausted to fight, but too scared to trust. A piece of old wire clung to her fetlock, the kind ranchers used decades ago before safer methods took over. Illegal now, without proper legal protections. The wire had cut deep, fresh enough to bleed, old enough to fester. For a moment, time held still. Eamon felt the forest watching him, judging him. Dakota stepped forward first. Softly, carefully. He lowered his head, breathing into the trapped mare's space. A gesture of reassurance, older than words. The mare blinked, her ragged breath wavering. She didn't pull away. Eamon exhaled slowly. "So that's what brought you here," he whispered. He knelt, instinct overriding doubt, cold seeping into his knees as he assessed the trapped leg. The mare trembled under his touch. But she didn't snap, didn't kick, didn't try to flee. She simply endured, as if she had already spent everything she had left trying to survive. Eamon swallowed hard. There are moments in a man's life when the world turns quietly, without storm or thunder, and asks him who he is. His answer, when it comes, is never loud. "All right, girl," he said softly. "I've got you." Above him, sunlight shifted through the trees like a slow blessing. Dakota stayed close, eyes steady, as if anchoring the moment. Eamon knew nothing about this mare, where she came from, who she belonged to, whether someone had left her or lost her. But in that frozen breath of morning, with the quiet of the woods pressing close around them, he understood one thing. Whatever happened next, he would not leave her here. The mare's breath quivered in the cold air, carrying a faint rasp that told Eamon more than he wished to know. She had been trapped here for a while, long enough for the wire to cut deep, long enough for the forest to swallow her sounds. Eamon slid a hand along her trembling shoulder, feeling every ridge of bone beneath the thin coat. Dakota stood nearby, shifting his weight but never stepping back, as if guarding the moment. The gulch was tight, barely wide enough for a grown man to crouch beside the mare, and the shadows pressed against them like a second, colder skin. "Easy now," he murmured again, though the mare's eyes told him she had heard too many promises broken. Her ears flicked weakly toward his voice. The trapped leg was twisted at a wrong angle, the wire cutting deep into swollen flesh. Whoever set that trap hadn't cared what stumbled into it, or maybe they knew exactly what they were doing. Eamon's stomach tightened. Wyoming ranchers fought droughts, coyotes, property taxes, and insurance adjusters, but most would never leave an animal to die like this. He eased the wire apart with gloved hands, careful not to jerk. The mare flinched, but didn't attempt to kick, which worried him more. A healthy horse fought fiercely. A broken one surrendered quietly. After a few painful minutes, the wire loosened enough for her to slide free. She collapsed onto her side, not in panic, but in exhaustion. Eamon brushed the dirt from her cheek, feeling the tremor that rippled through her body. Dakota stepped closer and lowered his head to the mare's neck, breathing into her coat the way horses reassure the wounded. Sunlight pierced the trees above them, falling as thin gold lines across her body. Dust motes drifted through the beams like slow-moving snow. Eamon could see now. This mare wasn't wild. Her hooves, though cracked, had once been properly trimmed. There was a faint scar under her jaw, a halter mark that hadn't fully faded. Someone owned her. Someone lost her. Or abandoned her. Eamon pushed that thought aside. There'd be time later for questions, maybe even for legal action if abuse was involved. But right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her out of here alive. He pressed a hand to her shaky flank. "Come on, girl," he whispered, a voice he hadn't used in years. "We're leaving this place." He wrapped his arms under her neck and shoulder, bracing his bad knee as he lifted. The mare lurched to her feet with a strained grunt, wobbling dangerously. Dakota maneuvered himself beside her, offering his body as steady ground. The mare leaned lightly against him, and somehow the two horses found a rhythm, awkward yet determined. They took one step, then another. Eamon guided them carefully out of the narrow gulch, clearing branches and making sure the mare didn't snag her wounded leg again. When they reached a patch of open earth, the mare let her weight sag for a moment, head low, nostrils flaring with each labored breath. Eamon stroked her forehead. "Good girl. You're tougher than you look." The mare blinked, and for a moment he saw something soften behind her fear. Recognition. Maybe hope. It had been a long time since Eamon felt anything like that reflected back at him. Too long. He checked the leg again. The swelling had worsened. Infection was creeping upward, darkening the skin around the cut. It needed cleaning, bandaging, and rest. He'd treated horses during his old mounted patrol days, had been briefed on emergency care, even knew a bit about equine insurance claims from back when the ranch still ran cattle. But nothing about the mare's condition could wait. "We're heading home," Eamon said quietly. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth. Dakota stayed close to the mare as they moved through the forest. Eamon walked on her injured side, one hand steadying her, the other ready to brace if she stumbled. Several times she faltered, shaking with the effort, but Dakota nudged her gently, refusing to let her give up. Together, they made their slow way back to the clearing where Eamon's land opened wide under the sky. When they stepped past the last of the trees, the mare froze. The open space must have felt like another world after days trapped in shadow. She lifted her head slightly, ears forward, as if tasting the horizon. Eamon watched her, feeling a knot rise in his throat at the way the sunlight touched her coat. She wasn't beautiful. Not now. But there was something undeniably brave about her presence. As they crossed the field toward the remnants of the ranch, Eamon became aware of how exposed everything looked. The broken house, the sagging barn, the old windmill that hadn't turned in years. It struck him then. He wasn't bringing this mare to a safe haven. He was bringing her to ruins. But it was all he had. And for now, it had to be enough. Dakota led the way to the barn, the mare following with uneven steps. Inside, beams groaned softly in the afternoon breeze, but the structure held. Eamon cleared a stall as best he could, spreading old hay into a fresh bed. When the mare finally lay, down with a long, trembling sigh, something in Eamon eased too. Not relief exactly, but a small, welcome shift inside the hardened quiet he'd carried for years. "I'll take care of you," he whispered, almost surprised to hear his own promise. "You're safe here." Dakota stood beside him, ears tilted forward, watching the mare settle. For the first time since returning to Wyoming, Eamon felt the faint pull of purpose, fragile, but real. The kind a man feels when he's needed again. Outside, the wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow. Eamon stepped into the open air, feeling the weight of the sky settle around him. In the quiet, something stirred that hadn't moved in him for decades. A sense that today had changed more than just the fate of a wounded mare. It had changed the course of his own. The afternoon had begun to lean toward evening by the time Eamon stepped out of the barn, leaving the exhausted mare resting on her bed of hay. The western light fell low across the Wyoming plains, stretching shadows long and thin, like memories that refuse to stay buried. Dakota lingered by the open barn door, glancing toward the mare every few seconds, before returning to Eamon's side. The gelding's loyalty raised a quiet ache inside him. Some things, it seemed, held on even when a man didn't deserve it. Eamon rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, feeling the grit of dust and years under his palms. He had no antibiotics, no clean wraps, nothing but a half-empty first-aid tin he'd kept in the truck out of habit. The mare needed real supplies: hydrogen peroxide, gauze, maybe even a tetanus shot if infection had taken root. He let out a breath and tightened Dakota's cinch. The horse flicked his tail, ready before Eamon even swung into the saddle. "Just a quick trip to town?" he murmured. As they reached the main road, the skyline of the small town appeared in muted tones of blue and gold. Nothing had changed much. Wyoming towns rarely did. But the sense of distance felt sharper now. Eamon guided Dakota past the hardware store, past the insurance office he'd once visited with his father, past the quiet diner where ranchers gathered before dawn. He kept his head down, hoping to slip through unnoticed. But small towns rarely allow that. "Eamon Harlow?" The voice was unmistakably sharp, the kind that could slice through a saloon brawl without raising in volume. Sheriff Marla Givens leaned against her patrol truck, arms crossed, her eyes scanning him with that mixture of skepticism and concern she'd perfected over years of dealing with ranch disputes and winter tragedies. He pulled Dakota to a stop. "Sheriff, you're a long way from nowhere," she said. "Heard you were back for good." Eamon shrugged. Back, at least. Marla approached, her boots crunching over gravel. She studied Dakota's sweat marks, the dust on Eamon's jacket, the strain in his posture. She had always been a reader of quiet signs. "You look like you've been riding through trouble." Eamon considered brushing it off, but something in Marla's expression held him. She was one of the few who had treated him decently when he left town years ago, helping him file paperwork for veterans' health care coverage when he didn't know where else to go. She wasn't someone he felt the need to hide from. "There's a mare," he said slowly. "Young, hurt bad, found her trapped near the ridge." Marla's expression changed. Not surprise, but something warier. "What kind of injury?" "Wire around the leg, deep." He paused. Looked intentional. Marla exhaled through her nose. "We've had incidents. Stock going missing, claims of neglect, nothing proven. Folks can get real protective of their business reputations when money's involved." "Any names?" Eamon asked. She hesitated, which told him more than an answer would have. "There's talk about Briggs Cattle Company," she finally said. "Nothing official. But if you found a horse like that, someone's going to come looking." Eamon felt Dakota shift under him, sensing the tension. The wind lifted a swirl of dust between them. "You're saying the mare might be stolen?" he asked. "I'm saying," Marla replied softly, "that some people prefer their problems to stay buried. And if that horse is part of one, they won't be pleased she turned up alive." Before Eamon could respond, the sound of a diesel engine rolled through the street. A white truck with polished chrome pulled into view, sunlight glinting off its spotless hood. The Briggs logo was painted across the side in bold, proud lettering. Carter Briggs stepped out, as though the entire town were a stage built solely for him. His boots were immaculate, his vest expensive, and his smile sharp enough to cause infection. He approached with the casual confidence of a man who believed property lines and moral lines were written only for other people. "Well now," Carter drawled, eyes settling on Eamon. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts. Heard the family ranch fell into disrepair. Shame, really. Land like that shouldn't be wasted. Eamon kept his voice level. Not for sale. Carter chuckled. Everything's for sale when a place is crumbling. And from the looks of you, Harlow, you're not exactly swimming in options. Marla stepped between them before tension could harden into something uglier. Mr. Briggs, she said evenly. Evening. Carter tipped his hat, all manners on the surface. Sheriff? His gaze slid back to Eamon. Say, Harlow, you haven't seen a chestnut mare around your property, have you? One of mine slipped out a week ago. Happens sometimes with spirited stock. Eamon held his breath. Dakota's muscles coiled beneath him. No, he said. Not a lie. Carter didn't deserve the truth. Carter studied him with a predator's patience. Funny thing about animals, they go where they feel welcome, or where they shouldn't. He smiled thinly. If she turns up, you let me know. I'd hate to get the law involved. Animal welfare laws can be complicated. Marla's jaw tightened. Carter tipped his hat again and walked back to his truck, climbing in with a flourish that felt rehearsed. As the engine roared to life, the air thickened with diesel fumes and unspoken threats. When he'd gone, Marla turned to Eamon. Be careful, she said quietly. Whatever you found out there, it's now part of something bigger. Eamon nodded once. I'll manage. I know you will, she said, but don't manage it alone. Dakota shifted, ready to move. Eamon adjusted the reins and gave Marla a small nod before riding off. The setting sun cast long shadows across the main street, stretching between buildings like warnings. As he headed toward home, the weight of Carter's words pressed against his spine. Trouble wasn't coming. It had already found him. And it was wearing a polished pair of boots. By the time Eamon reached the ranch, twilight had settled over the land like a slow-moving veil. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open, and the mare lifted her head from the hay, her ears flicking toward him with a cautious curiosity. Dakota moved to her side immediately, as if reporting for duty. The wind outside had dropped, leaving the world so still that Eamon could hear the mare's labored breathing beneath the soft rustle of hay. He knelt beside her, touching her forehead gently. Warm. Too warm. Fever was setting in. You didn't have many good choices, did you? He murmured. The mare blinked slowly. Her trust was still a thin, fragile thread. But she didn't shy from his touch now. Eamon rose, grabbed the bucket he had scrubbed earlier, and crossed to the metal sink near the barn window. The water from the pump was frigid, but he soaked a cloth anyway, wringing it out with hands that shook more from worry than cold. He pressed the cool cloth to the mare's neck to lower her temperature, whispering soft reassurances he used to give frightened horses during patrol missions. He needed proper medical supplies. The peroxide he'd bought barely covered surface wounds. This mare required more. Anti-inflammatory paste, a clean wrapping kit, maybe even antibiotics. The kind stocked in the feed store's locked cabinet, the kind that required identification and paperwork. Maybe even legal protections if Carter Briggs decided to escalate. Eamon exhaled through his teeth. He'd have to go back into town at dawn. For now, he had to keep her steady through the night. A gust of wind rattled the side of the barn, bringing a whisper of cold that seeped through the cracks. Snowflakes drifted past the window, soft at first, then steadily increasing until they smudged the horizon. Dakota threw his head up, ears pricked sharply at the shift Eamon, looked to the barn door, listening. Snowstorms in Wyoming had a way of building quietly before tearing through the plains with sudden fury. He stepped outside, breath fogging instantly. The wind picked up from the north, carrying the unmistakable taste of heavy snow. Clouds rolled in fast, dark, layered, impatient. He had seen storms like this while deployed in the mountains overseas, storms that came without warning and swallowed whole valleys. He glanced back at the barn. The mare couldn't survive being caught out in the open if the roof failed. The barn walls were old, the beams tired. They'd hold through a mild winter night, maybe, but not what he saw sweeping across the ridge now. He re-entered the barn and ran his hand along Dakota's neck. "We're moving her," he said. Dakota stamped once, ready. Eamon eased the mare to her feet. She trembled under her own weight, breath coming in uneven bursts, but she followed Dakota's steadying presence. Step by step, they made their way toward the back exit, the one closer to the cellar. The wind roared louder. Snow hit the roof like handfuls of gravel. A loose gutter banged against the siding, echoing through the rafters like a warning shot. Outside, the temperature had plummeted in minutes. Snow lashed sideways, turning the world into a spinning blur. Eamon shielded the mare's face with his coat, pulling her close. Dakota pushed himself against her other side, almost nudging her forward with his shoulder. The path to the cellar was barely visible. The snow had already reached Eamon's ankles. The mare stumbled, nearly going down, and Eamon braced her with all his strength, teeth clenched against the strain. His knee screamed in protest. Dakota circled, pressing against her flank until she regained balance. Together, they pushed forward. Halfway across the yard, a sharp crack split the air, a distant tree giving way under the weight of ice. The mare froze, muscles quivering. Eamon stroked her neck. "Easy, easy, girl. Keep going." By the time they reached the cellar door, the snow had risen to mid-calf. Eamon wrestled the latch open, and the warm air inside rushed out like a sigh of relief. He led the mare down the narrow steps, Dakota following with practiced care. The cellar was dim, lit only by the small lantern Eamon kept on a crate. Shadows moved along the stone walls, but the air inside was still, comforting. A pocket of safety carved beneath the cold earth. The mare collapsed onto the thick blanket Eamon had spread earlier. Her sides rose and fell rapidly, sweat chilling against her coat. Dakota settled near the doorway, a silent sentinel. Eamon knelt beside the mare, checking her temperature with the back of his hand. Too high. He needed something stronger than cold cloths. His mind raced through memories of the mounted patrol's emergency kits, topical antiseptics, wound powder, wraps. He had none of it here. As the wind howled outside, Eamon sat back, rubbing tired, hands over his face. The snowstorm battered the ranch above, shaking loose, dry soil from the ceiling beams. He thought of Carter Briggs and his polished boots, of Marla's concerned eyes, of the mare's narrow tracks leading into the gulch. None of this was coincidence. Someone wanted this horse gone, if not dead, then lost enough to be forgotten. But she hadn't been forgotten. Dakota's breathing was steady beside him. The mare lifted her head weakly, brown eyes searching his face as if asking whether this strange shelter was truly meant for her. Eamon reached out and brushed a strand of damp forelock from her cheek. "You're staying," he said softly. "No one's taking you out of here." Outside, the storm thickened, burying the ranch in silence. The wind shrieked once more, then dampened into a low, steady roar. Snow piled against the cellar door, sealing them in. Eamon wrapped the mare's leg with the cleanest strip of cloth he had, working by the soft lantern glow. Through the long winter night, as the storm pounded the world above them, He kept talking to her. Low, steady words, and the mare listened, even when her eyes fluttered with exhaustion. Dakota lay close, warming the space with his broad, calm presence. For hours, Eamon tended wounds, kept watch, and prayed the fever wouldn't climb. And somewhere between the storm's fury and the mare's trembling breaths, he realized something. He hadn't felt this much responsibility, this much purpose, in years. It scared him, and it saved him. The storm did not ease. It sharpened, pressing its cold breath deeper into the seams of the earth, as if trying to peel the ranch from the map entirely. Beneath it, the cellar held firm, but the walls felt closer than they had hours before. Eamon sat with his back against a wooden crate, lantern light casting soft halos across the mare's heaving sides. Her breathing came in uneven draws, each one sounding thinner than the last. Dakota stood at the entrance of the cellar, head lowered, ears pivoting to track the wind's direction like a weather vane carved from muscle and instinct. Eamon checked the mare's leg again. The makeshift wrap had soaked through. The infection had turned the wound hot and taut. He wished he had a proper emergency veterinary care kit, bandages, antiseptic wash, injectable antibiotics, but all he had was a few odds and ends from his truck and the experience of someone who had patched up more horses than he cared to remember. The fever pulsed under her skin, radiating into his palms. She lifted her head weakly when he touched her, a faint gesture of trust that tugged at places inside him he thought long sealed. Above them, the storm struck the ridge with a violent crack that reverberated through the stone walls. Dust drifted from the beams overhead. Dakota jerked his head up, nostrils flaring. Even the mare flinched, though her strength was nearly spent. Eamon rose slowly, unsteady from hours without rest. He approached the cellar door and pressed his weight against it. Snow had piled thick on the outside, deadening the sound of the storm, but making the air inside heavier. For a moment he thought he felt the earth shift. Not much, just a subtle tremor, like the ground complaining under too much ice. When he turned back, the mare's eyes had closed. Panic flared in his chest. He knelt beside her, placing a hand gently under her jaw. Her pulse was fast but faint. He whispered something. He didn't know if it was a prayer or a promise, and dipped the cloth again into the bucket. The water had grown cloudy, but it was still cold enough to draw some heat from her neck. He dabbed carefully, watching the fur darken with moisture. "You're not dying tonight," he murmured. "Not while I'm here." The storm answered with another low groan, wind dragging long fingers across the roof like something searching for a way in. The cellar door shifted just slightly on its hinges, as if the weight of the storm was testing its resolve. Eamon placed another log onto the small iron stove he'd brought in earlier, its warmth filling the cramped space. The glow threw shadows across the mare's flank, across Dakota's quiet form. A strange peace settled for a moment, quiet, fragile, the kind that comes before something breaks. Then the earth gave a warning, a deep, rolling crack, not from the sky this time, but from the ridge behind the house, stone splitting under the pressure of ice. Dakota lifted his head sharply, ears forward. The mare's breath hitched. Eamon shot to his feet. Another crack followed. Louder. Closer. It was the unmistakable sound of a slab of frozen rock losing its grip. "Damn," Eamon whispered, A thunder of snow and ice slammed down somewhere above them. The ground shuddered. A shower of dust fell from the beams. The lantern flickered violently. Dakota moved to stand protectively between Eamon and the mare, his body angled, his stance wide. The horse's training, years of patrol work, returned in an instant. Eamon grabbed hold of the support post and steadied himself against the vibrations. The ridge wasn't collapsing fully, not yet, but a portion of it had sheared off from the weight of ice. The storm had carved out the weakest point and pushed. More snow thundered down, the sound like distant artillery. Dull, heavy, final. Eamon glanced at the cellar ceiling. Old wood, stone packed in by his father decades ago. Good work, but everything has limits. He reached for Dakota's bridle, steadying the gelding. Easy, boy. We're safe down here. We stay put. Dakota's breath came in warm bursts against his sleeve. The tremors eased. For the moment, the ground grew still again, though the storm continued to snarl outside, beating against the buried cellar door. Eamon knelt once more beside the mare, whose breaths had grown shallow. He brushed her cheek with a thumb. "You hang on," he said softly. "The storm will pass, I promise." He didn't say the rest, that if the ridge fell again, they'd be trapped. Or worse. The mare shifted, her trembling less frequent now, her eyes half-lidded but alert to his voice. Eamon took that as a small victory. He leaned back against the stone wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Memories fluttered in, the sound of boots on gravel during his service days, the quiet hum of nights spent on patrol, the way a horse calmed a man faster than any veteran's mental health resource ever could. He had spent years moving from town to town, never staying long enough to unpack his past or mend the parts of himself that had splintered. But here, in this small cellar, tending to a wounded mare with Dakota beside him, something in him felt anchored again. Hours passed. The storm clawed and scraped, but the cellar held. At one point, snow forced its way under a narrow gap near the doorframe, and Eamon covered it with his coat to keep the cold from spreading across the floor. Dakota lowered himself onto the hay, breathing slow and steady, his body heat warming the space around the mare. Eamon stayed awake through the long hours, checking the mare's pulse, adjusting the bandage, talking to her in a low drawl that filled the silence. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a new kind of quiet formed. A quiet made of determination and a stubborn, unlikely hope. Near dawn, a faint shift in the air awakened him. He didn't know how long he'd drifted, sitting upright with his hand resting near the mare's neck. Dakota rose first, ears trained on the door. Eamon listened. The storm had changed. The wind had dropped from a scream to a whisper. The weight against the cellar door seemed lighter, as if the snow was no longer being thrown sideways, but falling gently. He lifted the lantern and checked the mare. Her breathing was still shallow, but the fever had stopped climbing. It wasn't gone, but it had reached its peak and held. Relief washed through him in a slow, heavy wave. He exhaled, shoulders sagging. "You made it through the worst," he whispered. "We all did." Outside, dawn touched the buried ranch with a muted pink glow, though none of them could see it through the snow-packed door. The ridge had taken a beating, part of it torn loose, but the cellar, this stubborn pocket of earth, had protected them. For the first time in many years, Eamon felt something close to gratitude, and something he hadn't felt in decades. Purpose. When Eamon finally pushed the cellar door open, the morning air rolled in like a blessing, cold, raw, but carrying the unmistakable scent of survival. The world outside had transformed into a white, silent sea. Snowbanks curled over the fences, burying them entirely. The trees bowed under the weight of the storm as if in quiet prayer. For a long moment, Eamon stood there, letting the pale pink light wash across his face. After the night they'd lived through, the dawn felt fragile, something he didn't dare disturb with sudden movement. Dakota climbed the steps beside him, nostrils flaring at the crisp air. The gelding's stance was different today, prouder, more awake, as if the storm had sharpened him instead of wearing him down. He nudged Eamon's shoulder once, a gentle reminder that they weren't finished, not by a long shot. Eamon reached up and stroked the horse's cheek, feeling that familiar steadiness beneath his palm. Dakota was more than a companion. He was the kind of anchor that kept a man from drifting into old darkness. Eamon turned back into the cellar where the mare lay, her head resting on the blanket, her breath thin but consistent. The fever had broken sometime in the quiet hours before dawn. Her coat was damp, her body exhausted, but the wild panic that had once lived in her eyes had softened into something else. Tentative trust, maybe, or the simple relief of no longer being alone. Eamon crouched beside her, checking her pulse, then brushing a strand of forelock away from her eyes. She blinked, slow and deliberate, as if greeting him for the first time. "You're still with us," he whispered. "Good girl." Her ear twitched toward the sound. Eamon cleaned her leg again, replacing the soaked cloth with fresh fabric torn from an old flannel shirt he'd sacrificed without hesitation. The swelling remained, but the angry heat had cooled a little. Infection was still a threat, but the immediate danger had passed. He would need proper medicine soon. Antibiotics, wrapping supplies, maybe even professional care if the infection worsened. Wyoming had strict animal welfare laws, and if he didn't treat the mare properly, someone could accuse him of neglect. The irony was sharp. The only person who might try was likely the one who abandoned her. He exhaled slowly and sat down, letting his back rest against the packed dirt wall. The night had left its mark on him, his muscles stiff, his knee throbbing with each shift in posture. Age, he thought, had a cruel honesty to it, but pain was familiar ground, almost comforting in its predictability. What felt new was the quiet certainty rising inside him, a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt since his mounted patrol years, before the war and the drifting, before he learned how easy it was to lose your place in the world. The mare lifted her head again, watching him with a soft intensity that made something tighten in his chest. There was no fear now, only a fragile curiosity. Eamon reached for the bucket of water, tilting it gently toward her. She drank in slow, greedy swallows, the sound echoing softly in the cramped room. Dakota stepped closer, lowering his head to check on her, and the mare's nose brushed lightly against his. That tiny gesture, a touch barely there, felt like a spark warming the cold corners of the cellar. "She likes you," Eamon murmured. Dakota flicked his ear as if dismissing the comment, but he stayed close. The sun rose higher, sending shafts of gold through the snow-packed doorway. Eamon moved to clear some of the drift, scraping snow aside with an old feed scoop. His breath fogged in front of him, each exhale mingling with the morning stillness. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to Carter Briggs. The man's polished boots, his too-easy smile, the way he twisted words into threats. It all settled like a stone in the pit of Eamon's stomach. Briggs would come again. He wouldn't let the mare disappear quietly. Not if she had value. And especially not if her being found threatened his reputation. Eamon dragged another scoop of snow out of the way. "Let him come," he muttered. He wasn't the same man who wandered from motel to motel, trying to forget postcards he never sent and promises he never kept. The storm had stripped him down to something simpler, older, closer to the person he'd been before life turned him into a ghost at his own doorstep. A soft whinny rose from the cellar. Not Dakota. The mare. Eamon turned. She had managed to shift her weight, propping herself onto her front knees. Her eyes were alert, watching him, waiting for something that wasn't a command but an invitation. Eamon knelt beside her. "You trying to stand?" he asked softly. She exhaled through her nose, a shaky breath, and pressed her hooves into the dirt. Slowly, trembling, she lifted herself to her feet. Dakota stood beside her, offering his shoulder to lean on. The mare leaned into him, grateful but cautious. Eamon steadied her from the other side. The moment she found her balance, a wobbly, uneven balance, but hers, Eamon felt the shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first warm breeze of spring sneaking through the last breath of winter. Victory, he realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it just stood quietly on four shaky legs and looked at you with tired eyes. He smiled, a small curve of the lips he hadn't felt in years. "Good girl," he said. "That's it. You're stronger than you know." She seemed to understand. Or maybe she simply liked the softness in his voice. Either way, she didn't look away. Outside, the light brightened. The storm was gone. The ridge had held. The house still stood in pieces, but the land had endured. And somehow, against every odd, the three of them had made it through the night together. Eamon rested his hand lightly on the mare's neck. She closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth. "Willow," he whispered, testing the name, letting it settle into the space between them. Her ear flicked toward him. Dakota blew a warm breath past Eamon's shoulder as if giving approval. Willow. The name stuck. Eamon stood, his back cracking, and looked toward the winter sky beyond the cellar door. "We've got work to do," he murmured to both horses and perhaps to himself. "A lot of it." For the first time in decades, the future didn't look empty. It looked like responsibility. It looked like purpose. It looked like hope. The sun had climbed just high enough to turn the fresh snow into a soft shimmer when Eamon led Willow and Dakota out of the cellar. The mare stepped carefully, testing each placement of her injured leg, but she was moving. Truly moving. For the first time since he'd found her wedged between the stones. Each breath she took steamed gently in the cold morning air. Dakota walked beside her, not touching, but ready to shoulder her weight if she faltered. Eamon watched them for a moment, feeling that quiet pride only horsemen understand, when a creature who has suffered still chooses to rise. He guided Willow back to the barn and settled her into the cleaner of the two stalls, lining it with fresh hay he'd forked together from higher, drier bales. The storm had left the barn roof intact, but a thin draft cut through the boards, brushing Willow's coat like a cold whisper. Eamon draped a heavy canvas over the stall's open slats, blocking most of the wind. She blinked at him, ears loose, posture soft. She trusted him now, at least enough to eat and rest without trembling. Eamon rubbed a hand down her neck. "You've got a fight in you, girl. Keep it." He stepped out of the stall, only then realizing how exhausted he was. The storm had aged him a year overnight. His joints felt stiff, and his breath steamed heavily every time he exhaled. He reached for Dakota, resting a hand on the gelding's withers for balance. Dakota lowered his head and snorted softly, as if reminding Eamon that leaning on him was allowed. The ranch lay quiet for a while. Too quiet. It wasn't until Eamon stepped outside with an empty water bucket that he heard the sound. A distant engine rolling over fresh snow, too smooth to belong to an older pickup, the kind of engine that hummed because its owner never let it suffer winter or dirt. Eamon felt the muscles in his back tighten. Dakota lifted his head, ears snapping toward the road. A moment later, sunlight glinted off the white hood of a familiar truck. Carter Briggs drove slow, deliberate, as though savoring the view of the Harlow property buried under clean snow. He pulled up near the broken fence line, leaving deep tire tracks through the untouched drifts. The door swung open, and Carter stepped out with the self-assurance of a man who believed the world bent to where he pointed his boots. "Morning, Harlow," he called, voice carrying easily across the yard. "Hope you fared well in the storm." Eamon didn't answer. He stood with one hand on Dakota's bridle, the other wrapped around the bucket handle, watching Carter stride toward him with a kind of smug purpose. Carter stopped a few feet away, flashing a smile sharper than the ice on the fence rails. "Heard a lot of things blow off their foundations last night," he said. "Barns, sheds, even livestock fences. Storm like that. Dangerous time to lose animals." Eamon kept his voice flat. "What do you want, Carter?" Carter spread his hands, feigning innocence. "Just checking in on the neighborhood. Thought I'd see if you came across a chestnut mare of mine. She went missing last week. Pretty little thing. Can't imagine she'd last long in this weather." Dakota stepped forward a half-inch, placing himself subtly between Eamon and Carter. Carter's eyes flicked toward the gelding, a small annoyance flashing across his face. Eamon held Carter's gaze. "You already asked me that." "Well," Carter said, adjusting his gloves, "storms have a way of exposing things. Fresh tracks, broken branches, signs of life where there shouldn't be." Eamon didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. "The mare I found was trapped in an old wire snare." Carter's smile thinned. "Accidents happen." "That wasn't an accident." A pause, just long enough for truth to hang between them. Carter stepped closer. "Look, I'm not here to argue. I'm here because if she's my animal, I'm entitled to take her back. Wyoming property rights are very clear on that. A rancher's livestock belongs to him, even if it strays. And if someone interferes, well, there are legal protections for that sort of thing." Eamon didn't move. "You abandoned her." Carter's nostrils flared. "Watch your mouth, Harlow. You're new back in town. You don't know half of what people have been saying." "I know what I saw," Eamon replied quietly. "A mare left to die." Carter's voice softened dangerously. "You think the sheriff will take your word over mine? You, an old drifter living on a condemned property without proper rural property insurance? Or me, a man who employs half the county?" Eamon didn't answer. Dakota shifted, reading the tension like a map. Carter leaned in just enough to let his breath fog between them. "If that mare is here, bring her out. Now. I'll load her up and be on my way." Eamon stared at him for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he set the bucket down, slowly, deliberately. Dakota lowered his head in mirrored readiness. "She's not yours anymore," Eamon said softly. "She chose to survive, and she's under my care now. If you want her, you'll need more than words." Carter's smile faded entirely. "You're making a mistake," he murmured. A serious one. Then take me to court, Eamon replied. Let's see how the judge feels about wire traps and a horse left to starve in the cold. For the first time, Carter's expression slipped. The veneer cracked. There was a flicker of something mean behind his eyes. Something that knew guilt. Eamon didn't back down. Minutes passed in silence before Carter straightened his coat, the charm forced back onto his face like a mask. Have it your way, he said lightly. But don't say I didn't warn you. He turned, walking back to his truck with a confidence that no longer rang true. He climbed in, slammed the door, and reversed, down the drive in a spray of powdery snow. When he reached the road, he gunned the engine, leaving deep tracks behind him, tracks that cut across the fresh white like scars. When the sound finally faded, the ranch returned to the quiet of the morning. Dakota nudged Eamon's arm softly. Eamon let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The threat was no longer subtle. Carter knew. Carter would return. And this time, he wouldn't come alone. For the next several days, winter held the valley in its quiet grip. Snow glazed the wide fields in a thin, shimmering crust, and every sound seemed softened by the cold. Dakota's steady hoofbeats, the mare's careful shifting in her stall, even Eamon's own footsteps in the barn. In that stillness, something like routine began to form. It wasn't the routine of a thriving ranch, not anymore, but the rhythm of a man who had something to tend to again, something fragile and alive that depended on him. Each morning, Eamon checked Willow's leg first. The swelling had begun to ease, and her fever no longer radiated through her skin. She rested more deeply now, breathing slower, the exhaustion of survival giving way to a quiet steadiness. The infection still lingered, but Eamon's careful cleaning and makeshift dressings kept it from worsening. He knew horsemen in town who might help, but asking them meant questions, and questions meant risk. For now, he trusted his own hands, seasoned by years of patrol work and simple Wyoming living. Willow's appetite improved too. She stretched her neck toward the hay with more confidence each day, tearing into it with small but determined bites. Dakota often stood nearby, as if supervising her progress. Sometimes she reached her muzzle toward him in a tentative, grateful touch. Those simple interactions, the tilt of ears, the soft exchange of breath, pulled Eamon in deeper than he expected. He found himself slowing down around them, letting the quiet fill in the cracks inside him that had been widening for years. But healing wasn't just her burden. One late morning, while Eamon loosened Willow's bandage, she shifted her head toward him, her dark eye following his movements with an intensity he wasn't ready for. He paused. The way she looked at him was different, lighter, curious, without the dull glaze of exhaustion. Dakota whickered softly behind him, as though announcing she'd passed some unspoken test. Easy, Eamon murmured, though his voice wavered. You're coming back strong. She nudged his shoulder, and the gesture nearly undid him. It was nothing, a small thing, a mere breath of contact, but something in that nudge touched him in a place he had boarded up long ago. He sat back on a bale of hay, wiping sweat from his brow even though the barn was cold. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel punishing. That afternoon, he decided to try something new. Come on, he said softly as he opened the stall door. Willow hesitated, shifting her weight nervously. Dakota stepped forward, lowering his head to her flank. The encouragement was subtle, but she responded by taking one careful step out of the stall. Her ears flicked forward, then sideways, gauging every sound. Eamon positioned himself on her injured side, not to lead, but to steady her if she faltered. Outside, sunlight spilled across the snow, warm despite the cold air. The moment Willow felt the open light on her coat, she froze, but not with fear. She lifted her head, breathing in the crisp air, as if recognizing the world again. Eamon watched, his own chest tightening with something that felt close to joy. "Let's try a little walk," he whispered. The first steps were small and uneven, her injured leg trembling as it carried part of her weight. But the tremble didn't last long. Dakota paced beside her, matching her slow rhythm. She leaned on him once, then twice, but each time steadied herself more quickly. Eamon kept close, his hand hovering just above her withers without actually touching her. He wanted her to feel her own strength. Snow crunched under their feet, the gentle sound carrying across the empty yard. It was the first life the ranch had seen in years. Willow continued forward, breath steady, eyes open. She wasn't just recovering, she was reclaiming something that had been taken from her. After a few minutes, she stopped, sides heaving. Eamon stroked her neck lightly. "Good. That's enough for now." She didn't resist returning to the barn, but when she reached the stall, she turned back toward him, ears pricked. It was the smallest question. "Are we done, or will we try again tomorrow?" Eamon smiled. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll go a little farther." As he hung the halter on its peg, his mind drifted. Not with worry, but with a strange clarity. He remembered how the VA counselor once told him that some men needed structure, others needed purpose, and then there were the ones like him, the ones who only felt whole when something depended on them. He had shrugged it off at the time, but now, watching Willow settle into the hay, he wondered if she'd seen into him more deeply than he'd realized. That evening, the sky dimmed into lavender and blue. Eamon stepped out into the yard, breathing in the sharp winter air. The ranch looked both ruinous and peaceful, like a place caught between endings and beginnings. Dakota grazed near the fence line, lifting his head occasionally to glance toward the barn. Willow rested quietly in her stall, and the land, buried under snow, felt less empty than it had in decades. Eamon leaned against the fence rail, letting the quiet press in. He knew Carter Briggs would not let things go. Wealthy men rarely tolerated being contradicted, especially by someone like him, someone they'd long ago decided no longer mattered. Carter would return with his polished boots and thin smiles, maybe with paperwork, maybe with the law, maybe with something worse. But Eamon wasn't the drifter he'd become after leaving home. He wasn't the soldier drifting through motels with a stack of unfiled veterans' disability benefits forms. He wasn't the ghost who avoided mirrors because they reminded him of promises broken. He was here, with this land, with these horses, with a reason to rise each morning. As a faint wind moved across the field, Eamon turned toward the barn once more. Willow lifted her head, ears pricked toward him as though sensing his gaze. "You're getting better," he whispered into the quiet evening. "And so am I." The stars began to blink awake one by one, steady and calm. Eamon stayed outside a long time, listening to the snow settle, letting the night hold him. Winter broke slowly that year, as if unsure whether Wyoming deserved the mercy. Day by day, the snow shrank back across the pasture, revealing patches of brown earth like old wounds finally allowed to breathe. The air softened, losing its sharp edge, and the creek thawed into a thin ribbon of moving water. Through it all, Willow strengthened. Each sunrise found her a little steadier, a little bolder. She no longer leaned into Dakota for balance. Sometimes she even walked ahead of him, curious, almost playful in her tentative steps. Eamon watched her from the porch one morning, coffee warm in his hands. The mug had a crack down the side, a reminder of some forgotten year, but it held, much like him. He sat there as the sky brightened, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Willow grazed near the corral fence, nose buried in fresh shoots that had pushed through the melting snow. Dakota stayed close, his quiet guardianship unchanged. Eamon could see their rhythm now. Willow stretching outward, Dakota steadying the edges, both of them moving in a world that had once felt too cold to live in. As he rose, his knee stiffened, a reminder of the years he carried. But the pain didn't bother him today. It was familiar, a companion rather than a burden. He walked to the barn to retrieve a small wooden box he'd kept tucked beneath a tarp. Inside lay the old tools he'd repaired: a rasp, a hoof pick, a handful of worn brushes. They weren't perfect, but they were enough to start rebuilding something that had died long before the storm. He approached Willow slowly, letting her sense him before he touched her. She lifted her head, ears forward, waiting without fear. The trust in her calm gaze still surprised him, even after weeks of tending her wounds. He worked quietly, brushing the dust from her coat, wiping the last traces of winter from her legs, and smoothing the new hair that had grown where infection once raged. This wasn't just grooming. It felt like a ritual of acknowledgement, of what she had survived, and what he had decided to become again. "You're ready," he murmured softly, as he closed the box. The breeze carried his voice across the open field. Willow shook her mane, the movement loose and effortless. Dakota stepped beside Eamon, touching his shoulder with a warm exhale. It was time. Eamon walked to the gate of the larger pasture, the one that hadn't held animals since his father's time. The hinges groaned in protest, but the gate swung open with a kind of weary dignity. Willow watched him from across the yard, sensing something changing in the air. Eamon gestured gently. "Come on, girl. See what the world looks like now." Willow took a few careful steps toward him, pausing just at the threshold where the barn's shadow ended and the open land began. The sunlight caught the lighter strands in her coat, turning the wounds of winter into faint, silvery lines. Dakota gave her a soft nudge from behind, and she stepped forward. Hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. The moment her hooves touched the wider field, something shifted in her. She lifted her head higher than she ever had in the barn, tasting the wind, as if discovering a piece of herself she thought was gone. Then she moved. One step, two, then a slow trot that drummed lightly across the thawing ground. Eamon held his breath, bracing for her to stumble. She didn't. Willow gathered herself, stretched her neck, and broke into a run. It wasn't fast, not yet. Her injured leg still carried memory of pain, but there was freedom in her stride. Real, unrestrained freedom, as she circled the wide field, kicking up flecks of melting snow. Dakota galloped after her, his larger frame more powerful, but he kept his pace gentle, letting her lead. Willow ran again, this time faster, her tail lifting in the breeze like a small banner. The morning light wrapped around her, and for a moment Eamon could almost see the horse she once was, the horse she would become again. He felt something tighten in his throat and swallowed hard against the unexpected sting. He hadn't cried in years. Not when he buried his parents. Not when he left home. Not even during the nights when loneliness felt like a second skin. But watching Willow find her legs, her will, her place, the emotion rose so quietly he almost didn't notice it. "You did it," he whispered. He didn't know if he meant her, himself, or both. As Willow slowed to a trot, Dakota fell in beside her. They returned to Eamon together, breath steaming, eyes bright, the quiet joy of movement still humming through their bodies. Willow reached him first and nudged his coat, her soft breath warming the fabric. He placed a hand on her cheek, feeling the steady life beneath her skin. "You're home now," he said softly. "If you want it." Later that afternoon, a dusty sedan pulled up near the gate, crunching slowly over the thawing gravel. A man stepped out, gray at the temples, the kind of weary posture that comes from carrying too many years alone. He approached hesitantly, hat in hand. "Sir," the man called, voice trembling with a mix of hope and desperation, "I heard. They told me this place takes in strays." Eamon studied him, saw the tremor in his fingers, the long miles in his eyes, and understood immediately. Not every stray walked on 4 legs. "Yes," Eamon said, opening the gate. "This is the place." The man nodded, relief softening his shoulders. Eamon guided him toward the small cabin he had begun repairing, the sign hanging loosely above the porch, pieces of cedar carved with careful hands. Willow Creek Sanctuary, a home for the broken. As evening settled, Dakota grazed quietly by the fence. Willow stood nearby, head lifted toward the fading sun. From the porch, Eamon watched them both, feeling the weight of the day settle into a kind of peace he hadn't known since he was young. He rested his hands on the railing, breathed deeply, and let the world become still. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a man returning. He felt like a man who had finally arrived. If this story touched something quiet in you, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment in your own words, just a line or two. And if you'd like to walk with me into the next story, go ahead and subscribe. There's more to share, more to remember, and more to feel together.